You could put a black man like you in a $60,000 truck and a funeral suit, but you still drive down my road looking like you've got the whole pharmacy in the back.
Deputy Brett Maddox sneered, his lips curling with pure condescension. He didn't just talk, he executed a sudden, aggressive hand sweep, forcefully hurling a beautifully crafted cedar box straight onto the grease-stained gravel. Ceramic shattered. A century of handwritten family history exploded into the dirt. Maddox violently towed a worn black Bible, letting out a harsh, barking laugh.
Look at this garbage! Go on, Darlene, watch from the window! Ha! This is what 22 years of road sense looks like. People like you think a fancy tie buys you citizenship in Bowen County. It doesn't.
The tall, gray-templed black man stood frozen at the bumper. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He just took one long, ice-cold breath. His hands wide open where the deputy's laser could see them. Beside him, his 15-year-old son was forced onto his knees in the muck. Wrists violently bound by heavy plastic zip ties. Maddox yanked a folded black garment out next, aggressively throwing the shapeless fabric directly into a puddle of black motor oil. The deputy grinned wide, completely blind to the cell phone recording from the napkin holder inside. He flipped open a gold-stamped leather folio he'd snatched from the spilled jacket. The grin died instantly. Under the harsh Georgia sun, the laminated seal read the Honorable Solomon A. Hayes, United States District Judge. And a mile back, the floor began to creak. Now, before you watch this deputy learn exactly who he chose, you need to understand how a United States District Judge ended up on his knees in the gravel behind a county diner on the morning of his own father's funeral. Because it did not start on that road. It started 30 hours earlier, and 200 miles north, in a federal courthouse, with a man in a black robe signing his name to an order that a great many dangerous people did not want signed. His name was Solomon Augustus Hayes. He was 52 years old. 10 months earlier, he had raised his right hand and become a judge of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. One of the few hundred people in the entire country trusted to sit on a federal bench. But before the robe, he had spent 14 years of his life as a prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. 14 years. Putting men in prison for one specific crime. The crime of using a government badge to do to a citizen what the Constitution forbids. He had stood in front of juries and recited a statute so many times he could say it in his sleep. Title 18 of the United States Code. Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Solomon Hayes did not know that law from a book. He knew it the way a surgeon knows a heart. From the inside. With his hands. On the afternoon his father died. Judge Hayes was finishing the most dangerous case of his career. A domestic militia. Men who called themselves the Sons of the Old Republic. A racially motivated bombing plot. And a defendant named Coyle, who had a great many friends who were still free. And who had decided, out loud, on the kind of websites where men say such things, that the black federal judge sitting on the case would not live to see a verdict. The threats were specific enough that the United States Marshals Service had quietly assigned Judge Hayes a protective detail, plainclothes, low profile, a team that shadowed him to and from the courthouse in unmarked vehicles, and that he had been told, more than once, would be a discreet distance behind him, wherever he went. For as long as the danger lasted, he had not asked for it. He found it almost embarrassing. He was a careful man who had spent his life believing that the law itself was protection enough. He was signing the day's last order when his clerk knocked and told him his wife was on the phone, and that she said it could not wait. Adele Hayes did not cry on the phone. She told him plainly, the way you tell a strong man a hard thing, that his father was gone. Deacon Samuel J. Hayes, 84 years old. He had gone to sleep on a Friday afternoon in the house he had lived in for 50 years, and he had not woken up, and the funeral would be Saturday. In Calvary, in Bowen County, in the small Georgia town where Solomon Hayes had been born, and which he had spent 30 years driving away from. Solomon set down his pen. He looked at the order he had just signed, and the seal on the wall, and the framed commission that made him a judge of the United States. And for a long moment, none of it meant anything at all. Because his father was dead, he drove home and he packed it. He hung a dark suit in the back of the truck, and beside it, out of a habit 14 years deep, he hung a spare judicial robe in a garment bag, because a man in his position learns to keep one near. And then he went down the hall to the room where his 15-year-old son slept, and he sat on the edge of the bed. And he woke Isaiah the gentle way, with a hand on his shoulder, and he told his boy that his grandfather had passed, and that they were going to drive down to Calvary together, the two of them, to put him in the ground. Isaiah Hayes was 15. He was tall for it, already taller than his mother, with his grandfather's long hands and his father's quiet. He had spent 2 weeks of nearly every summer of his life in Calvary, fishing the brown water with the old man, sitting in the front pew of Mount Pisgah Missionary Baptist Church while his grandfather passed the offering plate, eating breakfast every single Saturday morning at a diner called Birdie's Cafe, where the old man had eaten breakfast for 40 years. Isaiah loved his grandfather, the uncomplicated way a boy loves a grandfather. He got dressed without a word, and he carried his own bag to the truck. Before they left, Solomon went into his father's old cedar chest, the one Loretta had shipped north to him years ago, and he took out a small cedar box that his father had given him on the day he was confirmed to the bench. Inside that box were the things that had mattered most to Samuel Hayes: a worn black family Bible with 100 years of births and marriages and deaths written by hand across the inside cover, a pair of reading glasses, a small wedding photograph of Sam and Loretta as young people, framed in white porcelain, and, folded in tissue, gone soft with age, a single water-stained card, the size of a playing card, that Solomon's father had carried in his wallet every day for 59 years. Solomon packed the cedar box carefully into the truck, between the seats, because his mother would want these things at the funeral, and because he could not stand the thought of them riding in the dark of the truck bed. His wife walked him to the driveway. She straightened his collar, the way she did, and she looked at her husband, the federal judge, the careful man, and she said the thing that he would turn over in his mind 1,000 times in the days that came after. "Solomon," she said, "when you get down there, into that county, you carry yourself like exactly who you are. You don't shrink for anybody. You let them watch you be your father's son. You hear me?" He kissed her. He told her he would call when they crossed the county line. Then he sent a single text message to a number in his phone marked only with 2 initials, the way he had been instructed. The number belonged to Deputy United States Marshal Yvonne Pace, the woman who led his protective detail. He told her where he was going, and why, and how long he would be gone. The reply came back in under a minute. 3 words: "We have you." Solomon Hayes pulled his truck onto the interstate a little after 6 in the evening and turned south, into the dark, toward the town he was born in, to bury his father. His 15-year-old son slept against the window beside him, and a discreet distance back, where he could not see them and mostly forgot they were there. 2 unmarked vehicles carrying federal marshals slid onto the highway behind him and settled in for the long drive south. They reached Calvary a little before midnight, and the town received them, the way that town received most things from the outside world. With its arms crossed, Calvary, Georgia, was a county seat that the highway had long ago forgotten. A courthouse square and a feed store and 2 churches and a diner. Set down in the middle of Bowen County, which was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and had known them for 4 generations. And where a black family that had lived there 100 years still got watched at the gas pump like they might be casing it. Solomon had grown up understanding the exact temperature of that watching. He had spent his whole adult life 200 miles north precisely, so that his own son would never have to learn it. And now he was driving his son straight back into it. At midnight, to bury the man who had taught him to survive it, his mother was waiting up. Loretta Hayes was 79 years old, a small woman gone silver, who had buried a husband that afternoon in her heart and would bury him in the ground on Saturday. And when her son came up the porch steps, she did not collapse into him. She took his face in both of her hands, the way she had done when he was a boy, and she held it, and she looked at him for a long time. And then she said, "There he is. There's my judge." And then, only then, she let herself cry, with her son's face still in her hands. In the morning, the church held a wake. Mount Pisgah Missionary Baptist was a white clapboard building with a single steeple, and Samuel Hayes had been a deacon there for half a century. And so it filled. People came in their good clothes, and they brought food in foil pans, and they stood in the fellowship hall, and they told the son the stories. The way people do, each one handing Solomon a small piece of his father he had not held before. The man Sam had pulled out of the river in 1971. The mortgage Sam had quietly paid 2 months of when the Pruitt family was about to lose the house. A young woman, not so young now, who stood up in front of the whole hall and said that when she was 17 and pregnant, and her own daddy had put her out, it was Deacon Hayes who drove to the house at midnight and sat on that porch with her father until the door opened again, and that her son was a grown man with children of his own, because one old man would not let a girl sleep in her car. A line cook from the diner who said Sam tipped the same on a cup of coffee as he did on a full plate, every Saturday for 40 years, and that the one time the boy had been short at the register, Sam had covered it without a word and never mentioned it again. And the 40 years of Saturday breakfasts at Bertie's, same booth, same waitress, 2 eggs over medium, where the old man held court and settled arguments and remembered every child's name and every child's troubles. And everyone in that hall agreed, without anyone needing to take a vote on it, the steadiest man in the county. The kind of man whose steadiness you do not measure until the day it is gone. And the room it used to hold up goes quiet, and then an old man came across the fellowship hall, slow, leaning on a cane, and the room sort of parted for him, and Solomon rose to meet him. His name was Amos Petway. He was 79, the same as Loretta, and he had been Samuel Hayes's closest friend for 60 years. He took Solomon's hand in both of his, and his hands were shaking, and he said the ordinary kind things a man says at a wake. But Solomon, who had spent 14 years reading witnesses, saw something move behind the old man's eyes when he said them. A shadow, a thing carried. Amos Petway looked, for one moment, like a man who had something he needed to say, and had decided, again, not to say it. He patted Solomon's hand twice, and he shuffled away to a folding chair against the wall, and he sat there for the rest of the wake, alone, looking at nothing. Solomon noticed it. He filed it away, the way he filed everything, and then the day swallowed it. That night, in his mother's house, Solomon could not sleep. At 3 in the morning, he came down to the kitchen, And he set the cedar box on the table, under the one light. And he opened it, the Bible, the glasses, the wedding photograph, and the card. He took the card out of its tissue, and he held it under the light. It was a voter registration certificate, issued by the Board of Registrars of Bowen County, Georgia. And the date on it was the spring of 1965. And the name on it was Samuel J. Hayes. And in the corner, in a clerk's tired hand, was a number. Registrant number 14. Solomon knew the story. His father had told it to him exactly once, when Solomon was a young man leaving for law school, and had never told it again, and had never needed to. In the spring of 1965, the road to the county registrar's office in Calvary ran across a low concrete span over a creek, a span the locals called Farrell Bridge. And in that spring, a line of black men and women had walked across Farrell Bridge to register to vote, which was their right, and which the men of Bowen County had decided they would not have. There were deputies waiting on the far side of the bridge. There were other men with them, men without badges, but with the badge's blessing. And when the line reached the middle of the span, the men came for them with batons and with axe handles, and they beat them down onto the concrete. And Samuel Hayes, who was 25 years old, was beaten so badly that he carried the knot of it in his skull for the rest of his life. He did not run. When he could stand, he got up, and he walked the rest of the way across that bridge, with the blood drying on his collar, and he went into the registrar's office, and he registered to vote, the 14th man to sign his name that day. And the clerk handed him that card. His father had carried that card every day for 59 years, through every wallet he ever owned. Solomon had asked him once, as a young man, why a person would carry a piece of paper for that long. And his father had looked at him and said only this: so I never forget what it cost, and so I never let anybody tell me I don't belong where I paid to stand. Solomon Hayes sat alone in his dead father's kitchen at 3 a.m, and he held that card in his 2 hands. The card his father had bled across a bridge to earn, and he understood it the way you understand certain things only when the man who could explain them is gone. He wrapped it back in its tissue. He laid it in the cedar box, on top of the Bible, where his mother would want it for the funeral, and he closed the lid. In the morning, before the 11 o'clock service, he was going to take his son to breakfast at Bertie's Cafe, because his father had eaten there every Saturday for 40 years. Because it was the one thing in this whole bitter county that was simple and good, and his father's, because his boy should sit in his grandfather's booth. One time, on the day they buried him, it was the most ordinary plan in the world. Bertie's Cafe sat on the county road a half-mile out from the square, a low brick building with a gravel lot and a propane cage by the door and a hand-painted sign that had not changed in 30 years. Inside, it smelled like coffee and bacon grease and the cut hay coming off the fields across the road. There was a long counter and a row of booths under the windows. And at the third booth on the left, a small brass plate had been screwed to the wall years ago that read, with the county's particular dry humor, Sam's Pef. Darlene Pruitt was working the floor. She was 61 years old, and she had carried plates in that cafe for 31 years. And she had served Samuel Hayes his 2 eggs over medium, every Saturday morning for most of them. And when Solomon and his boy came through the door and she understood who they were, her eyes filled, and she had to turn away to the coffee station for a moment before she could come over. She seated them at Sam's booth. She told them breakfast was on the house this morning, and she would hear no argument about it. She brought the boy a stack of pancakes, and she put a hand on Solomon's shoulder, and she said his daddy was the finest man she ever served. And then she left them to it, and went back behind the counter. And that was where she was standing when the cruiser pulled into the lot. Deputy Brett Maddox had been a sheriff's deputy in Bowen County for 22 years. And for most of them, he had worked the county road. And he was, in his own telling, the best interdiction officer the county had ever produced. He had learned the trade from a retired sergeant named Earl Tibbet, a man who had run the department's training for a generation. And Tibbet had taught him a philosophy that Maddox repeated to younger deputies as though it were scripture. Tibbet called it the itch. The idea was that a real road cop could feel a dirty vehicle before he could prove it. A prickle at the back of the neck. And that the proof was just paperwork you built afterward to fit the feeling. Trust the itch, Tibbet used to say, and the cause will come. Brett Maddox had built a career on the itch. Over the last 4 years, he had pulled over more than 900 vehicles on that county road. And in a county that was more than a third black and brown, nearly 4 out of every 5 drivers he stopped, searched, and emptied onto the shoulder were black or brown. He had almost never found a thing worth a charge. He had never once seen that as a problem. He saw it as the price of vigilance. He had been parked in the shade of the water tower when the black Suburban with the Fulton County plates had gone by. A black man at the wheel in a suit. And the itch had come up the back of his neck like an old friend. And Brett Maddox had pulled out and followed it into the lot at Bertie's Bar. He came through the door, and he stood there a moment, letting the room feel him. And then he walked to the booth where the judge and his son were finishing breakfast. And he put his knuckles on the table. "That's your truck out there?" The Fulton County plates. Solomon Hayes looked up. "It is. Long way from Fulton County." Maddox smiled without any of it reaching his eyes. "Let me see your license and registration." "No." In the half-second before he answered, a great many things moved through Solomon Hayes's mind at once, with the speed of a man who did this for a living from the other side. He had, in the inside pocket of his suit jacket, a leather folio. And in that folio was a credential that identified him as a judge of the United States District Court. And the moment he produced it, this entire encounter would end. The deputy would go pale and stammer and back away, and there would be no search and no incident, and they would make the funeral on time. He could end it in 3 seconds, and he did not do it. He did not do it because he had spent 14 years prosecuting men exactly like the one standing over his table. And he knew, with the certainty of long experience, that this deputy did not do this only to federal judges. This deputy did this to everyone who came down his road looking like Solomon Hayes. He did it to old men and to nurses coming off the night shift, and to somebody's 19-year-old. And none of them had a folio in their jacket. And none of them had 2 United States Marshals sitting a mile back. If Solomon flashed the credential, he would save himself. This morning, and he would walk away, and the road would still be there tomorrow doing the same thing to people who could not save themselves. But if he let it happen, on the record, with a camera running, while a federal protective detail watched from a distance, then for once, there would be a witness, withstanding, and a record that could not be waved away. And maybe, the road itself could be made to answer. So Solomon Hayes made a choice that most men could not make, and that no man should ever have to. He decided to let it happen. He took out his wallet, slowly, and he handed up his driver's license, and only his driver's license. And he kept the folio in his jacket. And while the deputy looked at the license, Solomon turned to his son, and quietly, calmly, he said, "Isaiah, leave your phone here on the table, propped up in the napkin holder. Pointed out the window. Leave it running. Then come outside with me. And whatever happens, you keep your hands where they can be seen. And you do not say one word. You let me do the talking. Do you understand me?" Isaiah did not understand, but he had been raised to trust that voice. He set his phone in the napkin holder, screen toward the lot, recording. And he followed his father out the door, in the gravel lot, under the flat September sun. It went the way Solomon knew it would go. Maddox handed the license back. Except, he did not hand it back. He put it in his own shirt pocket, and the registration with it, which is a small thing and an enormous thing, because a man without his license is a man who cannot simply drive away. Then he walked a slow circle around the truck, and he stopped, and he lifted his chin, and he said the words, the magic words, the ones that no camera can contradict and no driver can disprove. I'm going to be honest with you. Patna, I can smell it. He sniffed the air theatrically. I can smell it coming off this vehicle. That gives me probable cause. And I'm going to search it now. You can make this easy or you can make it hard. I don't consent to a search. Solomon said evenly, I want that on the record. I do not consent. Noted, said Maddox. And he opened the door. What followed was not a search. It was a punishment. Maddox went through that truck the way a man tears up a house he means to leave, pulling the boy's bag out and dumping it across the gravel, sweeping the contents of the console onto the ground, yanking the seats forward, and then he found, wedged between the seats where Solomon had placed it, so it would not ride in the dark, the cedar box. He did not open it. He looked at the black man in the funeral suit, and he picked the box up, and with a sudden, contemptuous sweep of his arm, he hurled it onto the grease-stained gravel. The lid burst. The white porcelain frame holding Sam and Loretta's wedding photograph shattered against a stone. The worn black Bible struck the dirt face down and fanned open. 100 years of a family's births and marriages and deaths riffling in the breeze. The reading glasses bounced and lay still. And the small water-stained card, the card Samuel Hayes had carried for 59 years. The card he had bled across a bridge to earn, slid out across the gravel and came to rest, face up, near the propane cage. Look at this garbage, Maddox said. And he laughed, and he towed the Bible with the side of his boot. Go on, darlin'. Watch from the window. This is what 22 years of road sense looks like. He reached back into the truck and pulled out the garment bag, and unzipped it, and yanked out the folded black robe. And for a moment, even he did not seem to know what it was. This shapeless dark fabric. And he tossed it aside into a puddle of black motor oil at the edge of the lot, where it soaked through and lay like a drowned thing. And then he turned to the boy. Isaiah was 15 years old, standing by the bumper with his hands visible exactly as his father had told him, his face gone ash gray. And Maddox decided, out loud, that for everybody's safety the young man was going to be secured. He took Isaiah by the arm and turned him and pressed him down until the boy was on his knees in the wet gravel. And he pulled his wrists behind his back and bound them with heavy plastic zip ties. A 15-year-old child, on his knees, on the morning of his grandfather's funeral, for the crime of riding in a truck with his father, and through all of it, Solomon Hayes did not move and did not shout. He stood at the bumper with his hands open, and he held his father's breath in his chest, the long, slow breath his father had taught him. And he kept his eyes on his son. And he said, quietly, the only thing he allowed himself to say, eyes on me. Isaiah, you're all right. Keep breathing for me. Don't say anything. I'm building a record. You hear me. Everything that's happening here, we're building a record. And it is going to matter. Just breathe. Behind the window of the cafe, Darlene Pruitt stood with a coffee pot going cold in her hand and watched a deputy put a child on his knees in the gravel. and felt something rise up in her that she had spent 6 months trying to keep down. Because Darlene Pruitt had stood at that same window once before. It had been a morning, the previous March. Cold. The fields white with frost. Amos Petway, 79 years old. Samuel Hayes's oldest friend. One of the men who had walked across Farrell Bridge in 1965 and been beaten on the concrete beside Sam, had pulled into the lot at Bertie's for his breakfast. The way he did. And Brett Maddox had been there. And the itch had come. And Maddox had pulled the old man out of his car in the cold and searched it. And when Amos protested, when the old man raised his shaking voice to ask why, Maddox had cuffed him. He had found a bottle of the old man's heart medication in the console. A prescription, with the old man's name on the label. And because it was loose and not in its original packaging, or for some reason or no reason at all, he had poured the pills out into the gravel and ground them under his boot. And he had put Amos Petway, Deacon, bridge marcher, 79 years old, in the back of his cruiser, and driven him to the county lockup for the afternoon, over a charge that was quietly dropped a week later. Darlene had stood at the window that March morning and watched all of it. And she had not gone outside. She had told herself it was not her business. She had told herself a waitress in a small county does not cross the deputy who eats lunch at her counter. She had told herself a great many things. And she had stayed inside, behind the glass, with a coffee pot in her hand. And she had let it happen. And Amos Petway, after that morning, did not come back to Bertie's. The old man had eaten breakfast at that cafe for 40 years. And after the morning, Brett Maddox poured his heart pills into the gravel. He never walked through that door again. And every single day for 6 months, Darlene Pruitt had carried the sick weight of having watched and said nothing. Now there was another one in the gravel. And this one was a child. And this one was Sam Hayes's grandbaby. On the morning of Sam's funeral, Darlene Pruitt set the coffee pot down on the counter. And she walked out the door. Brett Maddox. He turned. Go back inside. Darlene, this is police business. I watched you do Amos Petway, right here in March. Her voice was shaking, and it did not stop. I watched you dump that old man's heart pills in the dirt and cuff him. And I stood at that window and I didn't say one word. And I have been sick about it every day since. And I am not doing it again. You let that child up off the ground. He is 15 years old. He is Sam Hayes's grandbaby. And his granddaddy is being buried in 3 hours. And you have got him hog-tied in the gravel. And I am standing right here. And I am not going back inside. Darlene, I am warning you. There's cameras. She lifted her arm and pointed up at the corner of the building, where a dusty security camera sat under the eave. The one the owner had mounted after a break-in. The one that pointed straight out at the lot. There has been a camera out here the whole time. Brett, it was running in March too, and I am going to make sure every soul in this county sees what is on it. Starting with what you did to that old man and ending with what you are doing to this baby right now. So you go on. You keep digging in that truck. The whole county's going to watch you do it. And Brett Maddox stood in the lot, with the morning coming apart at the edges. And he looked at the waitress. And he looked at the camera under the eave. And something changed in his face. Not shame. He was not built for shame. But the first cold touch of a man who has just realized the room he is standing in has windows he forgot about. And then, because he was the kind of man who cornered Dies Festa, he turned back to the truck to find the thing that would make all of it worth it. The thing that would prove he had been right all along. And his hand closed on a slim leather folio that had fallen out of the inside pocket of the suit jacket he had thrown across the seat. Gold stamped at the corner, and he flipped it open to see whose it was. Inside, Under a laminate that caught the white morning sun was an identification card. The photograph was of the tall gray man standing 10 feet away, and above the photograph, in raised federal lettering, were words that Brett Maddox read once, and then read again. Slower. The way you read a sentence, when your mind refuses to let it mean what it means. United States Courts. The Honorable Solomon A. Hayes, United States District Judge, Northern District of Georgia, and in the corner, the seal, the eagle, the scales, the gold catching the light and throwing it back. Brett Maddox's green did not fade. It died. It died the way a light dies when somebody cuts the wire behind the wall. Not a dimming. A sudden, absolute off. The man he had folded into his shirt pocket like a tip. The man whose son he had put on his knees in the gravel. The man whose father's Bible he had dumped in the dirt, was a judge of the United States. And Brett Maddox, 22 years on that road, stood in the lot of Bertie's Cafe, holding the credential in one hand and a dead man's reading glasses he had picked up off the gravel in the other, and felt the entire architecture of his life tilt under his boots. His voice came out wrong. Too high. He tried again. Anybody can get one of these made. Surplus stores. The internet. You can buy a fake badge online. You can buy. Deputy. Solomon Hayes had not moved. Stop talking. And that was when the road spoke to Brett Maddox one last time. And what it said was the sound of tires, out on the county road, where a minute before there had been nothing but heat shimmer, and a tractor crawling north. A line of black Suburbans came over the rise. 4 of them, then 6, newer than the one in the lot. Unmarked, headlights burning in the daylight, moving fast and tight in the way ordinary traffic never moves. The lead truck did not slow at the mouth of the lot. It turned in hard, gravel spitting off the tires, and the 5 behind it fanned across the entrance like a gate swinging shut. And the doors were opening before the trucks had fully stopped. And men and women in plain clothes and tactical vests were stepping out fast and unhurried at the same time, the way only people who do this for a living move. And across the back of every vest were 3 letters, the letters of the United States Marshal's Service. They had been a mile back the whole time. They had been a mile back since the county line. Deputy United States Marshal Yvonne Pace had been watching a federal judge eat breakfast through a long lens from across the county road for 40 minutes. And she had watched a deputy walk in. And she had watched them come out to the lot. And she had been on the radio with her team the entire time. Holding. Because a protective detail does not blow its cover and seize a local deputy on a hunch. And the man they protected had given no signal of distress. And then she had watched, through that lens, a grown man force a 15-year-old child onto his knees and bind his hands. And Yvonne Pace had said 2 words into the radio that she had been trained her whole career to be slow to say. We move. Pace crossed the lot at a walk that ate the distance. Her credentials, already up in her left hand, her right hand resting easy near her belt. Her voice pitched to carry to every person in that lot, and every microphone she correctly assumed was running. Deputy, step away from the vehicle. Step away from the judge. No. Deputy, United States Marshal, Yvonne Pace. United States Marshal's Service. Hands where I can see them. And step back. Maddox stepped back. He stepped back like a man stepping off a ledge he had not known was behind him. 2 marshals went straight to the boy. One of them, a young man, knelt in the gravel beside Isaiah and got a tool out and said, low and steady, the way you talk to somebody coming out of a wreck. Hey, hey. Song, I've got you. You're all right. I'm going to cut these off you right now. You did everything right. You hear me? We've got you. And he cut the zip ties. And Isaiah's hands came free. And the boy pulled them around in front of himself and looked at his wrists where the plastic had bitten in. And then he looked up and found his father. And Solomon Hayes was already moving. Finally moving. Crossing the gravel to his son and going down on one knee in front of him and taking the boy's face in both hands, the same way his own mother had taken his, on the porch steps. I've got you, Solomon said. It's over. You hear me? It's over. And you were perfect. You did everything right. You were perfect. Som and Isaiah Hayes, who had not cried, who had held his breath for 20 minutes the way his father taught him, and his father's father taught his father, finally let it go and put his face into his father's shoulder and cried the way a 15-year-old cries, while his father held the back of his neck and let him, kneeling in the gravel among his own father's scattered Bible, with a federal protective detail securing the lot around them. Marshal Pace stood over Brett Maddox, who had not been told to put his hands up, and had put them up anyway. For the record, Deputy, she said, loud and clear, and there is a great deal of record being made right now. The man you detained is the Honorable Solomon Hayes, a United States District Judge, who has been under the protection of this office for 11 weeks, pursuant to credible threats arising from a federal case. The minor you put on his knees and restrained is his son. I have personally observed this stop in its entirety. I would advise you not to say one more word, but that is your choice, and I will be noting which one you make. Brett Maddox looked at the judge, kneeling in the gravel with his crying son. He looked at the Bible in the dirt and the robe in the oil and the voter card by the propane cage. He looked at the waitress standing in her apron with her chin up. He looked at the camera under the eave. He looked at the 6 black trucks blocking the only way out of the lot. There was no direction he could look in that did not contain his ending. It took Sheriff Hollis Doss 11 minutes to reach the lot. And he came in hot. Light bar going. Because the radio traffic out of Birdie's had stopped making sense to him about 9 minutes in. He had been sheriff of Bowen County a long time. He had buried deputies and pinned medals and shaken every hand worth shaking between Calvary and the state line. And over those years, he had built a very particular understanding of how a morning like this was supposed to go. Quietly, locally, in his county, under his hand. He came around the corner of the building, already talking. All right. All right. Now, everybody just. And then he saw the 6 federal Suburbans, and the vests, and the word Marshal stenciled white across a half-dozen backs. And the rest of the sentence went out of him like air out of a tire. Marshal Pace met him at the edge of the lot. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. Sheriff, Yvonne Pace, United States Marshal's Service. I am going to save you some time, because the next 10 minutes are going to matter to you for a long while. That man by the truck is a United States District Judge, under federal protection. Your deputy detained him without cause, searched his vehicle without consent, dumped his late father's effects in the dirt on the morning of the funeral, and put the judge's 15-year-old son on his knees in restraints. My detail observed all of it. It is on our recording, and it is on the cafe's camera, and it is on the boy's phone. So before you say one word about your deputy, I would think hard about which side of this record you want your name to land on. Hollis Doss looked at her. He looked past her at Brett Maddox, standing with his hand still half up by the bumper, looking back at him with the face of a drowning man, watching the only boat in the water decide whether to turn around. And the sheriff did the thing he had done for years. The thing that had always worked. Because it had never once been tested by anyone he could not manage. He reached for the soft middle. Now hold on. Hold on. Now. He put his hands out. Palms down. Patting the air. I'm sure there's two sides to this. Brett's a good deputy. Never had a complaint stick. He runs that road hard, because that road needs running. We've got product moving up through this county, and he is good at. He turned toward Solomon. Switching to the warm voice now. The reasonable men voice. Your Honor, I'm sure if we all just slow down. There's been a misunderstanding here. And we can keep this. Sheriff Doss. Solomon Hayes rose from where he had been kneeling beside his son, and he came across the gravel, unhurried, and stopped a yard from the sheriff. His voice was as level as it had been the whole morning. There was no misunderstanding. I understood every second of it. I understood it when he put my license in his pocket. I understood it when he said he could smell something that was not there. I understood it when he poured my father's Bible into the dirt, and I understood it. And here, for the only time all morning, something moved under the level surface. Something that did not raise the voice, but cooled it another 10 degrees. When he put my son on his knees, there were not two sides to it. Sheriff, there was a man with a badge, and a 15-year-old boy, and a zip tie. I prosecuted this exact crime for 14 years before I took the bench. I know precisely which side of the line we are standing on. And now, so do you. He let that sit. Then he said, quietly, you told me his complaints never stuck. I would think very hard, Sheriff, about why they never stuck. Because there are going to be people, very soon, asking you that question who do not work for you. Hollis Doss had no answer. He stood in the lot he had run for years and felt it become, under his boots, a federal crime scene. And he closed his mouth. Because for the first time in his career there was no room left in it that he controlled. The marshals had already begun, with a care that was almost ceremony, to gather the dead man's things. A young deputy marshal crouched and lifted the cracked Bible out of the dirt with both hands, the way you lift something that matters, and brushed the grit from the cover, and gathered the loose century of names back into the spine 1 page at a time. Another lifted the reading glasses, and the broken porcelain frame, and the wedding photograph inside it, and another, near the propane cage, knelt, and picked up a small, water-stained card that had come to rest face up in the gravel, and read what it was, and went very still for a moment before he carried it over, holding it flat on his 2 palms, and laid it on the seat of the judge's truck with the rest. They photographed the robe where it lay in the oil before they lifted it. Everything was evidence now. The whole morning was evidence. That had been the point. That night, in his mother's house, after the statements were given, and the marshals had gone and the cedar box and its broken, gathered contents, sat on the kitchen table under the one light. Isaiah Hayes finally asked his father the question he had been holding all day. He asked it quietly, looking at the table, not at his father. You had it the whole time, he said. The card, the judge card, in your jacket. You could have showed it to him the second he walked up to the booth. And none of it would have happened. He'd have backed off. We would have just gone to the funeral. His voice cracked, and the anger came up under it, the way it does in a boy who has been frightened and is ashamed of having been frightened. Why did you let him do that? To Granddaddy's Bible. To me, you let him put me on the ground. And you had it the whole time. Why? And Solomon Hayes pulled a chair around so that he was sitting knee to knee with his son. And he did not reach for the easy answer. Because his boy was too old for the easy answer and had earned the hard one. Because I have done that man's job for 14 years. Solomon said. From the other side, I have sat across a table from 100 Brett Maddoxes, and I have read 1,000 of their reports. And I will tell you something I have known for a long time, and hoped you would not have to learn this young. That man does not do that only to federal judges. He does it to everybody who comes down his road looking like us. He did it to an old man in March. He has done it to people whose names we are going to find out. People who were just trying to get to work, just trying to get home. And not one of them had a card in their jacket. Not one of them had marshals a mile back. If I had shown him that folio, Soam, I would have saved you and me. This one morning, and I would have driven away. And tomorrow that road would still be there, doing the exact same thing to the next person who could not save themselves. He took his son's hands, the ones that still had the red lines bitten into the wrists. Your great-granddaddy was beaten on a bridge so your granddaddy could vote. Your granddaddy carried a card in his wallet for 59 years, so that you and I could stand up straight in a county like this one. They did not do that to make their own one day easier. They did it for the people who came after. And this morning, God forgive me for what it cost you. I had a chance that almost nobody ever gets. A chance to make this thing happen out in the open. On a camera. With a witness who cannot be waved away. So that the road itself can be made to answer for it. Not just for us. For Amos. For the next man. For your children. That is why I let him. And I am so sorry it had to be you on that ground. And I am so proud of how you stood it. That I do not have the words. He got up. Then, and he went to the cedar box on the table. And he took out the small water-stained card. And he put it in his son's hand. And he closed the boy's fingers around it. He carried this for 59 years. Solomon said, now you hold it for a while. And one day, you'll understand it the way I finally understood it today. Not because somebody told you, because you'll have stood somewhere you paid to stand and refused to be moved. Isaiah Hayes looked down at the card in his hand for a long time. And then, at last, he cried. Not the scared crying from the gravel, a different kind. And his grandmother came in from the next room and put her arms around them both. 3 generations in a dead man's kitchen, holding a card that had cost a bridge. The thing about putting a federal judge on his knees in a cafe parking lot is that it does not stay in the cafe parking lot. By Monday, the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, the same division where Solomon Hayes had spent 14 years of his life, had opened a formal inquiry. By Wednesday, it had widened from a single incident into what the law calls a pattern or practice investigation. Not just what Brett Maddox did to one man on one morning, but what the Bowen County Sheriff's Office had been doing to a great many people for a very long time. And the bitter irony, the one Solomon turned over in his hands in the long weeks that followed, was that he could have no part in any of it. He was the victim. And the witness, he had to recuse himself from everything the case touched, step back behind a wall of his own law, and watch other people carry the thing he had spent his whole career learning to carry. He, who knew Section 242 by heart, was now only permitted to be the man it had failed to protect, so others carried it, and they were good at it. The subpoena for Brett Maddox's stop records came back in a banker's box, and the numbers told the story the way numbers do. Flatly, without mercy. Over 4 years on the interdiction beat plyings, Maddox had initiated more than 900 traffic stops in a county that was a little over a third Black and Latino, nearly 4 out of every 5 people he pulled over. Searched, emptied onto the shoulder, and sent on their way with nothing found. Were black, or brown, He had written the phrase "I can smell it" into more than 200 reports. He had found something worth a charge in fewer than one stop in 30. The other 29 were people standing on the side of a road with their belongings in the dirt, and a story nobody, until now, had ever been required to hear. And once the investigators started pulling on the thread, the people came forward. The cafe's security camera gave them Amos Petway, 79 years old, a deacon, Samuel Hayes's friend of 60 years, who had stood on Farrell Bridge as a young man and stood again in that same lot in March, while a deputy poured his heart medication into the gravel and cuffed him for asking why. Darlene Pruitt, who had stayed at the window in March and walked out the door in September, sat with the investigators for 3 hours and gave them all of it. Dates, names, the things she had watched from behind that counter for years and swallowed. Because a waitress in a small county learns which things you do not say out loud. After Petway came the others. A migrant farm worker named Tomas Reyes, pulled over 4 times in a single summer, who had stopped driving the county road to his job and started walking an extra 2 miles to avoid it. A black travel nurse named Patrice Coleman, who worked nights at the county hospital and had been searched on her way home so many times that she kept her scrubs and her hospital badge on the passenger seat, like a passport she might have to show. A 19-year-old college student, home for the summer, made to lie face down on the center line of the county road at 11 o'clock at night while a dog circled his mother's Honda. None of them had ever filed a complaint. Most of them had assumed, the way you assume the weather, that there was no one to file it with. And behind Maddox, the investigators found the thing Solomon had heard in the very first words the deputy said. Because men learn a vocabulary somewhere, they found Earl Tibbett, the retired sergeant, 26 years, on the same road, who for a decade had run the department's interdiction training and had taught 2 generations of young deputies the philosophy he called, without embarrassment, the itch, the idea that a good road cop feels the wrong before he can prove it, and that the proof is a formality you build afterward to fit the feeling. It was in the training binders. It was on a whiteboard in a photograph from a department training session. It was, when you laid it next to 900 stop reports, not a philosophy at all. It was a machine for manufacturing probable cause, and it had been running, fully funded, and fully credentialed. For 20 years, the story broke nationally on a Thursday. A cable network ran the boy's phone video. 20 seconds of it, a deputy hurling a black judicial robe into an oil stain, a 15-year-old's hands bound behind his back in the gravel, and the rest of the country picked up the banner within the hour and did not put it down for 3 weeks. The robe in the gravel. It ran because of the robe, and because of the Bible, and because of the small water-stained card that a reporter from the Atlanta paper traced all the way back to a bridge, and to a young man named Samuel Hayes, registrant number 14, beaten in 1965. For the very same reason, his grandson was put on his knees 59 years later. For the crime of being where someone had decided he did not belong. It ran because every black family in America that had ever sat a son down and given him the talk about how to keep your hands on the wheel and your voice low and your movements slow, saw, in that 20 seconds of video, the precise thing the talk had always been about, and saw, for once, that it had been recorded, and that this time, somebody with 3 gold letters across her vest had been a mile back the whole time, watching, and had come. But Solomon Hayes, who watched the coverage from behind his wall of recusal, kept circling back to a colder fact, and he said it once, quietly, to his wife, in their kitchen. At night, they believed it because of who I am. He said, A federal judge. Marshals. A man who knows the statute. If I had been Amos Petway, it would have been one more old man in the gravel. And no one would have run a banner across the bottom of a screen. The only reason any of this is on television is that the system happened to do it to one of the few men it had agreed. On paper. To protect. He looked at the card on the counter. His father's card. In its new frame. That is not justice working. Adele. That is justice getting embarrassed into looking at itself. The United States charged Brett Maddox 8 months later. And it charged him the way the law charges a man when the law has been made to look at itself. Completely. The lead count was the one Solomon Hayes could have recited in his sleep. Title 18 of the United States Code. Section 242. Deprivation of rights under color of law. The statute written in the wreckage of Reconstruction for exactly this. For a man with a government badge, using it to do to a citizen what the Constitution forbids. They charged it twice. Once for the judge, and once for the boy, with the enhancement that applies when the victim is a child, and when bodily restraint is used. They added a conspiracy count. Because a thing a man is trained to do by a department that funds the training is not the act of one man alone. And they added falsifying federal records. For 200 reports built on a smell that was never there. The trial ran 9 days. Before a judge brought in from another district. In a courtroom, Solomon Hayes was not permitted to enter while it was in session, which was its own kind of sentence. Darlene Pruitt testified. She wore her good dress, and she did not look at Maddox once. And she told 12 jurors what she had watched from behind that counter for years, and what she had finally walked out the door to stop. Amos Petway testified. 79 years old, in a borrowed suit, walking to the stand on his cane. And he told the jury about March. And then, because the prosecutor asked him, he told them about a bridge in 1965, and a young man named Sam Hayes who had stood next to him while the batons came down. And you could have heard a pin drop on carpet. Patrice Coleman testified, and Tomas Regis, and the college student, who was 20 now. And each of them laid one more stop on the side of one road into the record, until the record was no longer about a single morning. It was about a road, and a county, and 20 years, and the centerpiece, the thing the jury asked to see 3 times during their deliberations, was 20 seconds of video shot by a 15-year-old boy who had propped his phone in a napkin holder against a cafe window because his father told him to make a record. The robe, the oil, the hands bound behind a child's back. There is no cross-examining a robe in the gravel. They convicted on every count. The judge sentenced Brett Maddox to 96 months in federal prison, stripped his certification for life, and entered a lifetime prohibition on his ever again carrying a firearm or wearing a badge in any jurisdiction of the United States. He went to a federal facility, 3 states away, where no one knew the road, and where the itch was worth exactly nothing. But Solomon Hayes never cared much about the 96 months. One man in a cell does not unmake 20 years of a road. The thing he cared about came later, and quieter. And it came in the form he had spent his whole life believing in. A consent decree. The Department of Justice in Bowen County signed it on the courthouse steps. It put the entire sheriff's office under federal supervision for 5 years. It ended gut-feeling interdiction training and burned the binders. From that day forward, every stop in that county would be recorded start to finish. No exception. With real discipline, for the camera that mysteriously malfunctioned, an independent monitor, with the power to subpoena, and a civilian review board. Half of its seats reserved for the parts of the county that had spent 20 years in the gravel, with the authority to open any complaint, and the guarantee that this time it would stick. Hollis Doss did not run for another term. He retired in the spring, with no medals pinned, and the county elected, for the first time in its history, a sheriff who had grown up on the wrong side of that road. The county settled the civil suit. 2. For a number that made the papers, Solomon Hayes did not keep $1 of it. He signed the entire settlement over to a fund, and he named the fund himself. And he named it after the man who had carried a voter card in his wallet for 59 years. The Samuel Hayes Fund, for the people on the side of the road who do not happen to be federal judges, and who need, exactly as much as he had needed, to be believed. They buried Deacon Samuel J. Hayes on a Sunday, one day later than they had planned, because the son who was meant to bury him on Saturday had spent that Saturday on his knees in a gravel lot. And the family had agreed, without anyone saying it out loud, that you do not bury a man like Sam Hayes in a hurry. And you do not bury him angry. Mount Pisgah Missionary Baptist Church was full to the doors and past them. The whole county came. The part of it that had loved Sam Hayes for 84 years. And now, the part of it that had read his name in the national papers and understood, late, what kind of man had been quietly eating 2 eggs over medium at Birdie's every Saturday morning for 40 years. Solomon Hayes gave the eulogy. He did not wear the robe. The robe had been to the cleaner, and then it would go into a frame, and then it would hang on a wall. But it did not belong on a man at his father's funeral, and he understood the difference now better than he ever had. He stood at the pulpit in a dark suit, and he held in his hands the cracked black family Bible, the one the Marshalls had, lifted out of the dirt and brushed clean, 100 years of names back in their place. And he opened it to a passage his father had marked 60 years before. And he read it in a voice that did not shake. And then he set the Bible down on the pulpit, and he reached into his breast pocket, and he held up a small water-stained card in a new frame. My father registered to vote in 1965. He told the full church. He was beaten for it, on Farrell Bridge, by men with badges who had decided he did not belong in the line. He was the 14th man to sign his name that day, and they handed him this card, and he carried it in his wallet for 59 years. And I will tell you the truth, I never understood, my whole life, why a man would carry a piece of paper for 59 years, until 8 months ago, when a deputy poured it out into the dirt of a parking lot, and I had to stand and watch a United States Marshal kneel down in the gravel and pick my father's card up off the ground and hand it back to me. He let the church sit in that silence. My father carried it, he said, so that I would not have to. That was the whole idea. He stood on that bridge so that his son could stand in a courtroom, and I built my entire life on that idea. I learned the law. I prosecuted the men who do what that deputy did. I put on the robe. I believed, all the way down to the bottom of myself, that if you only learned the law well enough, the law would keep you. And then I knelt in the gravel of my own father's funeral morning, and I watched the law do nothing at all. The badge did nothing. The statute I have known by heart for 20 years did nothing, until somebody happened to be a mile back, watching, until my 15-year-old son thought to leave a telephone running in a napkin holder. He looked out at them. He found his son in the second pew. So here is what my father's card means, and I want every soul in this room to carry it out those doors. The law did not save me. The witness saved me. The truth needed somebody to see it, and somebody to say it out loud. A waitress at a window, a boy with a phone, a marshal who would not look away. My father stood on a bridge to be a witness. Darlene Pruitt walked out of a door to be a witness. My son made a record of his own father in the dirt because I asked him to. That is the only thing that has ever moved this country one single inch. Not the badge, the witness. He picked the Bible back up, and he held it against his chest. And he said, "My daddy was registrant number 14, and he was the steadiest man in this county. And he is not gone, because every one of us in this room is the record he left behind." They sang him out. They laid Samuel Hayes in the red Georgia ground beside his people. And the cleaned robe later went into a frame on the wall of his son's chambers. And the small water-stained card went into a frame beside it, where Solomon Hayes could see it from the bench. Isaiah Hayes is 17 years old now. He carries a card in his wallet. It is a copy of his grandfather's voter registration certificate, made for him because he asked for it. The real one being framed and on a wall. He has started talking lately about law school. He has not told his father why. He thinks his father does not know. His father knows. A year after the gravel, Solomon Hayes was back on the bench in the Northern District of Georgia, hearing cases, wearing the robe, the same robe, the oil stain gone, but not, he will tell you. Forgotten, Darlene Pruitt still works at Birdie's 3 mornings a week. The other mornings, she drives out to the State Law Enforcement Academy, and she stands in front of rooms full of 22-year-olds with brand new badges. And she tells them about a window she once stood at, and a door she finally walked out of, and what the difference cost, and what it was worth. Amos Petway sits in the front pew at Mount Pisgah every Sunday morning, and he eats his breakfast at Birdie's again, in Sam's booth, under the little brass plate. And he and Darlene have made their peace. And Brett Maddox sits in a federal cell 3 states away from the only road he ever understood, where the itch is worth nothing, and the cause never comes. You watched all of that happen. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest, because no one is watching you the way that Lot was watching Brett Maddox. Darlene Pruitt stood at that window in March, and she saw a deputy pour an old man's heart pills into the gravel. And she said nothing, and she carried it for 6 months, sick about it every single day, until she was handed a second chance she did not deserve, and almost did not take. Most people never get the second chance. Most people only get the window. Once? So if you had been at that window in March, if you had seen the first old man go down in the dirt, and told yourself it was not your business, it was not your county, it was not your fight, what would you have done the second time, when it was a child, when it was on the morning of a funeral, when you already knew? This time, exactly what your silence had cost the last time. Because here is the thing this whole story is really about. Underneath the robe and the marshals in the federal trial, a man should not have to be a United States district judge to be believed on the side of a road. He should not need a protective detail a mile back, and a son with a phone, and 14 years of statute in his head. The next person in the gravel will be an old deacon, or a nurse coming off a night shift, or somebody's 19-year-old, face down on the center line at 11 at night. And there will be no banner across the bottom of the screen, and no marshals coming over the rise, and no cameras under the eave. There will only be whoever is standing at the window. So be the witness. Make the record. Walk out the door the first time, so that no one ever has to carry 6 months of being sick about the silence. If this story moved you, then say so. Like it, so it reaches the next person who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, honestly, would you have walked out the door in March, or would you have waited, like Darlene did, until it was a child in the gravel? Subscribe, because next week there is another one. The story of a woman that an entire small town had written off as nobody, and the single piece of paper she kept in a shoebox for 30 years. that brought the whole thing down, but that is a story for next time.